The sea was darker than expected, not black, not calm, but a heavy gray that seemed to absorb sound, the kind of water that does not splash so much as swallow. Inside the landing craft, the men stood shoulder to shoulder, rifles held upright, boots already wet from spray that leaked through seams, never meant for weather like this. No one spoke loudly. There was nothing useful left to say. Orders had been given days ago, then repeated, then memorized so thoroughly that repetition would only dull them. What remained was waiting, waiting for the ramp to drop, waiting for the first sound that would tell them whether the Germans were awake. Most of the men did not know exactly where they were going to land. They knew the name Juno, and they knew the names of French villages they had never seen, printed on maps that now felt theoretical. They knew the tide was late. They knew the bombardment had not gone as planned. They knew the sea was rough enough that some of the tanks meant to swim ahead of them had already disappeared beneath the surface. What they did not know was whether the concrete ahead of them was cracked or intact, whether the guns had been silenced or were simply waiting. This was not how fear usually announces itself. There was no panic, no shouting, no visible hesitation. The fear was quieter than that. It sat low in the chest and made the waiting feel longer than it was. Men checked straps they had already checked. Some stared at the ramp. Others stared at nothing in particular. A few tried to remember small details from home, not because they thought it would help, but because the mind looks for something stable when everything else is moving. For the German officers watching the coast that morning, the scene looked different. From their bunkers and observation posts, the channel appeared crowded with ships, but not unusually so. The invasion, when it came, looked broad and unfocused, spread across beaches that could not all be decisive at once. Canadian units were present, yes, but they were not the focus of concern. To German planners, the Canadians were still largely an extension of the British Army, capable, disciplined, but not exceptional. The real danger, they believed, lay elsewhere, either farther east at Calais or later when the true main effort revealed itself. That assumption mattered. It shaped how the early hours of June 6th unfolded. It shaped how quickly reserves were released, how aggressively counterattacks were planned, and how seriously reports from the coast were taken. When the first Canadian landing craft hit the sand, there was no sense among German commanders that they were about to encounter something different from what they had trained for. There was confidence that the Atlantic Wall, imperfect though it was, would do its job long enough for armor to arrive. The ramp dropped. Men ran forward into water deeper than expected, rifles held above their heads, packs dragging at their shoulders. Some were hit before they reached the sand. Others tripped on submerged obstacles and disappeared entirely. Machine gun fire came from angles that training diagrams never quite capture, low, lateral, cutting across the beach rather than straight at it. The bombardment that was supposed to soften the defenses had missed or failed. Concrete was intact. Guns were alive. What followed was not a single moment of heroism or collapse, but a series of small decisions made under pressure. Men went forward because stopping felt worse than moving. Sections broke apart and reformed around whoever was still standing. Orders became gestures. Intent replaced instruction. The Canadians did not surge forward as a wave. They advanced in fragments, each one pushing until it either stalled or broke through. From the German side, this was not immediately alarming. Attacks always looked chaotic in their opening moments. Infantry always took losses crossing open ground. What mattered was whether momentum collapsed. At Juno, it did not. The Canadians did not stop at the seawall. They did not wait for perfect coordination or ideal conditions. They moved laterally along the beach, flanking strongpoints that were supposed to dominate entire sectors. They closed with bunkers that had not been reduced, using grenades, rifle fire, and whatever cover the terrain offered. By mid-morning, reports from the coast began to change tone, not panicked, not dramatic, but sharper. Positions that were expected to hold for hours had fallen. Streets inside coastal villages were already contested. Prisoners were being taken, or not taken, faster than rear units could process. The Canadians were not behaving like troops content to secure a beachhead and wait. They were moving inland. This was the first quiet signal that something was wrong. German doctrine assumed that assault divisions would be vulnerable once they left naval gunfire range. That infantry advancing beyond the beaches would slow, reorganize, and present targets for counterattack. The Canadians disrupted that assumption. They advanced unevenly, sometimes too far, sometimes without proper support, but always with a sense of urgency that made it difficult to identify a clean point of containment. Fear, at this stage, was not personal. It was professional. It appeared in staff calculations and altered timelines. If these units were already inland, then reserves would need to be committed sooner. If reserves were committed sooner, then the question of where the main Allied effort lay became more dangerous to misjudge. By early afternoon, the Canadians had done something no one on the German side had expected them to do on the first day. They had created depth, not everywhere, not cleanly, but enough that maps no longer looked stable, enough that phrases like limited penetration no longer fit comfortably in situation reports. Inside the Canadian units, there was no sense of achievement yet. The men were too busy staying alive. Casualties were heavy, officers were missing, radios failed or went unanswered. Some units had advanced so far that they could hear German armor moving beyond the next rise, with no clear way to respond if it appeared. The success, such as it was, felt fragile, and yet it held. This is where the story of fear truly begins, not with myth, not with reputation, but with surprise. German commanders didn't fear the Canadians because they were brutal, or because they carried a legacy from the First World War, or because of anything written in training manuals. They feared them because on a day when chaos should have slowed everything down, the Canadians kept moving. By nightfall, Canadian patrols had reached positions deeper inland than any other Allied force on June 6th. Some would be forced to pull back. Others would dig in and wait. But the fact remained, the Canadians had not behaved as expected. They had not been cautious. They had not been tentative. They had treated the first day of the invasion not as a beginning, but as an opportunity. For the German officers reviewing the day's events, this was unsettling. It suggested an enemy that would not politely follow the phases of a defensive plan. An enemy willing to accept disorder in exchange for speed. An enemy that, once committed, did not easily disengage. Fear does not always arrive as dread. Sometimes it arrives as a recalculation. That recalculation was already underway by the time darkness fell over Normandy, and it would only deepen in the days that followed. The men who planned the defense of France in 1944 did not start from zero. They carried memories, some personal, some institutional, and some inherited so thoroughly that they no longer felt like memories at all. For many German officers, Canada was not an abstract nation on a map. It was a file, a pattern, a residue left behind by an earlier war that had never fully faded from the professional imagination. In the final years of the First World War, German units learned to read the battlefield the way sailors read weather. Certain signs meant trouble, an unusual concentration of artillery, a sudden tightening of patrols, a quiet sector that had gone unnaturally still, and sometimes the presence of Canadian units. By 1917, the Canadian Corps had developed a reputation not for recklessness, but for methodical violence. They prepared carefully, then struck hard, and kept pressing when other formations would pause. German intelligence officers noticed. German frontline troops noticed even more. The name attached to that reputation varied. Some called them storm troops, borrowing the language usually reserved for Germany's own elite assault units. Others used less formal descriptions, focusing on what the Canadians did rather than what they were called. They raided trenches aggressively. They pushed through shattered ground that stalled others. They treated objectives as problems to be solved, not lines to be held. None of which was myth. It was documented in after-action reports, prisoner interrogations, and battlefield correspondence. When the war ended in 1918, those impressions did not disappear. They settled into doctrine, into officer training, into the unspoken assumptions passed from senior to junior ranks. Many of the German commanders serving in Normandy in 1944 had been young officers or NCOs during the earlier war. They had not forgotten which formations tended to arrive before difficult moments. On the Canadian side, this legacy was neither romanticized nor ignored. It was formalized. The interwar Canadian Army was small, underfunded, and often overlooked, but it preserved a culture that emphasized initiative at the lowest levels. Junior leaders were expected to make decisions. Small units were trained to operate independently when plans unraveled. Aggressive patrolling was not treated as a specialist skill, but as a basic expectation. When Canada mobilized again in 1939, much of that ethos came with it. The men who trained the new divisions were often veterans of the previous war, or had been taught by those who were. The lessons they emphasized were practical rather than heroic. Move when the enemy hesitates. Keep pressure constant. Do not assume the enemy is finished until he is physically unable to continue. These were not slogans. They were habits. By the time Canadian units fought in Sicily and Italy in 1943, German troops encountered these habits again, this time reinforced by modern firepower. In the rubble of places like Ortona, Canadian infantry learned to fight at close range against experienced German formations. The fighting there was slow, intimate, and unforgiving. German paratroopers who survived those battles later remarked on the Canadians' refusal to disengage once contact was made. There was no dramatic breakthrough, no sweeping maneuver, just steady, grinding pressure that wore units down. That experience mattered. It meant that by the time Canadian divisions arrived in Britain to prepare for the invasion of France, they were no longer untested. They carried fresh combat knowledge, not just inherited doctrine. They understood how German units reacted under stress. They knew how quickly discipline could fracture when supply lines were cut or commanders killed. And they had learned that aggression, when controlled, could shorten battles that caution would prolong. German intelligence was aware of Canada's participation in earlier campaigns, but it tended to generalize. Canadians were grouped with British forces, treated as reliable but predictable. There was little effort to separate Canadian operational behavior from British patterns, despite evidence that they differed in important ways. This was not negligence so much as overconfidence. The Atlantic Wall was designed to blunt any assault long enough for mobile reserves to intervene. The identity of the attacking infantry was considered secondary. This is where the inherited reputation becomes paradoxical. German commanders remembered the Canadians of the First World War, but they did not fully integrate that memory into their expectations for 1944. The assumption was that whatever edge the Canadians once had been absorbed into the larger British system. That assumption would not survive contact with reality. On the eve of D-Day, General Harry Crerar addressed his men and reminded them of this lineage. He did not speak in grand terms. He spoke plainly, about characteristics the enemy had once feared and would come to fear again. This was not a speech meant to inflate pride. It was a reminder of responsibility. Reputation, in this sense, was not something to enjoy. It was something to live up to. When Canadian soldiers stepped into the water at Juno Beach, they did so carrying more than weapons and equipment. They carried a history that the enemy half remembered and half dismissed. Within hours, German commanders would begin to reassemble that memory, not from books or old reports, but from urgent messages coming off the coast. What they were rediscovering was not legend, it was continuity. And continuity, once recognized, is unsettling. The plan, on paper, assumed a certain rhythm. Bombardment would break the defenses. Infantry would land against a shaken enemy. Armor would follow, and momentum would build in controlled stages. It was not an unrealistic plan. It was simply dependent on conditions that did not exist on the morning of June 6th. At Juno Beach, the sea disrupted timing. The tide rose faster than expected. Landing craft arrived late, sometimes clustered together, sometimes scattered. The preliminary bombardment, already shortened to preserve surprise, missed many of its targets. German concrete bunkers stood intact, their firing slits dark and silent until the moment the ramps dropped. When the first Canadian soldiers stepped into the water, they were not advancing into a broken defense. They were walking into one that was waiting. From the German perspective, this should have worked. Static divisions like the 716th Infantry Division were designed for exactly this scenario. Absorb the shock, delay the attacker, force him to bleed on the sand while mobile reserves assembled inland. The Canadians were supposed to be pinned, disorganized. Contained they were not. What unfolded instead was something German commanders struggled to categorize. The Canadians did not pause to reorganize under fire. They did not wait for armor that had failed to arrive on schedule. They did not remain fixed on their assigned lanes once those lanes proved lethal. Small groups broke away from original plans and moved laterally, probing for gaps, climbing over seawalls, cutting through wire wherever it gave. This was not chaos in the sense of collapse. It was disorder used deliberately, a willingness to accept fragmentation in order to keep moving. German machine gun crews fired until barrels overheated. Mortar teams adjusted, fire repeatedly, trying to track targets that refused to remain where doctrine said they should. When one strong point continued firing, Canadians did not withdraw and request higher-level intervention. They worked around it. When another fell, they moved past it rather than consolidating. To German officers observing from inland positions, the reports coming in did not describe a clean, linear battle. They described infiltration. This mattered because infiltration undermines control. Static defenses rely on predictable enemy behavior. They are built to dominate specific arcs, to kill attackers who advance directly and in mass. When attackers break that pattern, the fortification becomes less a wall and more a series of isolated islands. That is exactly what happened along Juno. German positions that should have supported one another found themselves fighting alone. The Canadian advance did not look impressive in the way armored breakthroughs look impressive. There were no sweeping movements, no dramatic overruns. It looked messy. But by mid-morning, Canadian infantry were already fighting inside coastal villages that were supposed to hold until evening. Streets became battlefields. Houses changed hands room by room. Civilians hid in basements as fighting moved above them faster than anyone expected. German officers began to notice something else. The Canadians were not only advancing, they were doing so unevenly. Some units surged far ahead, while others lagged behind, pinned down or reorganizing. This created a jagged front that was difficult to counter. Where should reserves be committed if the enemy was both everywhere and nowhere? Where was the main effort if there was no obvious pause? By early afternoon, the problem deepened. Canadian units had pushed beyond the range where naval gunfire could reliably support them. According to defensive logic, this should have been the moment to strike. Yet local counterattacks met resistance sooner and closer than anticipated. Anti-tank weapons appeared in places German planners had not marked as threatened. Infantry fire came from unexpected angles. The Canadians were not waiting for the perfect moment to defend themselves. They were adapting in place. This was the point at which German commanders began to reassess not just the situation, but the enemy. The Canadians were not simply aggressive. They were comfortable operating without constant direction. Junior leaders took initiative without waiting for confirmation. When officers were killed or wounded, the units did not freeze. Someone else stepped forward. This behavior was not accidental, it was trained. But from the German side, it looked unsettlingly organic. It suggested an army whose cohesion did not depend entirely on hierarchy. An army that could absorb losses without losing shape. Fear in this context was not emotional, it was analytical. The Canadians were doing things that complicated German responses. They were compressing time, forcing decisions earlier than planned, and doing so with forces that were not supposed to be decisive on the first day. By the time German higher headquarters fully grasped how far Canadian units had advanced inland, the opportunity to treat Juno as a secondary problem was gone. The beachhead was not just established, it was active, it was expanding, and it was being held by troops who had already shown they were willing to move beyond what was expected of them. The assault was not supposed to work this way. That is precisely why it did. By early afternoon, the map no longer made sense in the way it was supposed to. The beachhead existed, that much was clear, but Canadian units were no longer behaving like forces tied to the shoreline. They were appearing in places the defensive plan had marked as unlikely to be contested before nightfall. This was not because everything had gone right, much of it had gone wrong. But momentum, once created, has a way of ignoring the reasons it should not exist. For the German commanders responsible for the sector opposite Juno, the problem was not simply that ground had been lost. It was that it had been lost too quickly, and not in a clean line. The Canadians were advancing in uneven thrusts, sometimes with armor, sometimes without it, sometimes so far forward that even their own headquarters struggled to locate them with precision. This created a sense of instability that radiated outward. When the enemy does not advance according to expectation, every estimate becomes suspect. The original assumption had been that once the Canadians cleared the immediate beach defenses, they would pause. That pause was critical. It would allow German mobile units to concentrate, identify the main axis of advance, and strike decisively. Instead, Canadian patrols and forward elements continued inland almost as soon as they had reorganized, pressing toward intermediate objectives with a speed that felt premature from a defensive standpoint. Premature advances are supposed to fail. These did not. Some Canadian units reached roads and rail lines that had been marked as rear area infrastructure. Others found themselves within sight of villages that German staff officers believed were safe for at least another day. This was deeply uncomfortable. Defensive depth relies on time. It relies on the attacker consuming hours fighting through prepared layers. The Canadians were compressing those layers. There was also an element of risk in what the Canadians were doing that German commanders immediately recognized. Advancing too far, too fast, without consolidated flanks or secure supply lines is dangerous. German doctrine emphasized exploiting exactly that kind of overextension. Yet, when probes and limited counterattacks were launched, they did not meet a brittle enemy. They met infantry already digging in, already positioning anti-tank weapons, already assuming that contact was inevitable. This suggested a mindset that went beyond orders. Canadian units were not advancing because they had been told to advance at all costs. They were advancing because their default assumption was that pressure should be maintained unless explicitly stopped. That difference is subtle but decisive. One relies on command direction, the other relies on habit. German field reports from the afternoon of June 6 began to reflect this unease. Language shifted from descriptions of landings to descriptions of penetrations, from enemy forces on the beach to enemy forces beyond the coastal zone. This was more than semantics. It marked the moment when the Canadians ceased to be seen as an invading force in transit and began to be treated as an occupying force already shaping the battle inland. Perhaps most troubling was the absence of a clear Canadian center of gravity. Some formations pushed deep and then stalled. Others lagged and then surged unexpectedly. This made it difficult to determine where a decisive counterstroke should fall. Committing reserves too early risked meeting only part of the enemy. Committing them too late risked losing key terrain without a fight. As evening approached, the realization hardened. The Canadians had reached, and in some cases exceeded, the deepest objectives assigned to any Allied formation on D-Day. Even where they were forced to withdraw slightly, the psychological impact remained. They had demonstrated that the depth was reachable, that it was not theoretical, that it could be touched. Fear at this stage was not yet personal. It had not become hatred or desperation. It was the colder fear of professionals recognizing that a familiar pattern had broken. The Canadians were not reckless, but they were not cautious either. They seemed comfortable operating in the narrow space between those two extremes, where initiative thrives and defensive plans fray. This forced German commanders to accelerate decisions they had hoped to delay. Mobile units were ordered to move sooner. Higher headquarters demanded clarity that could not yet be provided. And in that pressure, mistakes became more likely. Every hour the Canadians held their forward positions was an hour the defense failed to regain equilibrium. The Canadians, for their part, did not know how much unease they were causing. They knew only that stopping felt dangerous, that waiting invited counterattack, that the safest place, paradoxically, was often just a little farther forward. It was not bravado. It was instinct shaped by training and experience. By nightfall, the battle had not been decided, but something had shifted irreversibly. The Germans no longer asked whether the Canadians could be pushed back easily. They began asking what it would cost to do so. And that question, once asked, has a way of changing everything that follows. The arrival of the 12th SS Panzer Division did not initially bring relief to the German commanders watching the Canadian sector. It brought tension. This was an elite formation on paper, but it was also an unusual one, composed largely of teenagers raised inside a system that had taught them certainty before it had taught them restraint. Their officers were experienced, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front, but the division as a whole had never fought together under fire. Confidence was abundant. Experience was uneven. From the German perspective, this was the unit meant to restore order. The Canadians had moved too far, too quickly. The solution was a sharp counterstroke delivered with speed and aggression. The 12th SS was expected to do what static infantry divisions could not: hit hard, hit early, and push the attackers back toward the beaches before they could consolidate. The Canadians were not supposed to be a serious obstacle to this plan. They were assumed to be tired, disorganized, and exposed. The belief inside the SS command structure was that Allied infantry lacked the stomach for sustained close combat once the initial shock wore off. This belief had been reinforced by years of fighting in the East, where ideological framing had blurred reality into something simpler than it was. The first clashes shattered that simplicity. When the 12th SS struck Canadian positions near villages like Authie and Buren, the fighting did not unfold as expected. The Canadians did not break contact quickly. They did not retreat in confusion. Instead, they met the attack with a combination of stubborn defense and immediate counterpressure. Units that should have been overwhelmed instead clung to ground longer than doctrine predicted, forcing the SS to commit more men, more tanks, more time. What followed was not a clean victory for either side. It was a collision. Close-range fighting in villages reduced to rubble. Tanks firing at distances so short that adjustment was meaningless. Infantry fighting from basements, hedgerows, shell holes, anywhere that allowed them to stay alive long enough to fire again. This kind of fighting strips away illusion quickly. For the young SS soldiers, it was a shock. For their officers, it was a warning. The Canadians were not passive defenders. Even when forced back, they counterattacked almost immediately. Positions changed hands more than once. Losses mounted on both sides. But something else became apparent to the German commanders overseeing the engagement. The Canadians were learning. They adapted to SS tactics faster than expected. They adjusted anti-tank placements. They anticipated flanking movements. They exploited moments when SS coordination faltered. This was deeply unsettling. The 12th SS had been raised to believe that ideological resolve could compensate for inexperience. Against the Canadians, resolve met discipline, and discipline tends to last longer. Reports from the front began to change tone again. The Canadians were no longer described simply as advancing or defending. They were described as interfering, as frustrating, as difficult to disengage from. The SS. Attacks were achieving local success, but at a cost that felt disproportionate. Each village taken required another fight. Each Canadian withdrawal left behind resistance that had to be cleared. Then came the killings. Captured Canadian soldiers were executed in several locations. Whether driven by rage, doctrine, or fear, the effect was immediate and profound. News traveled quickly along the Canadian lines. It did not produce panic. It produced resolve of a colder kind. The knowledge that surrender might not be reciprocated hardened behavior on both sides. What had already been brutal became absolute. For the German commanders, this escalation had an unintended consequence. It removed the safety valve of surrender. Canadian units facing SS formations no longer assumed that capture would end a fight. German units began to realize the same was true in reverse. Encounters became more lethal because neither side expected mercy. This is where fear deepened, not fear of defeat, but fear of what engagement itself had become. The Canadians were no longer just an advancing force. They were an enemy that would not disengage easily and could not be easily coerced. Their willingness to fight the SS on equal terms without hesitation undermined the psychological advantage the Waffen-SS relied upon. Ideology loses power when the opponent does not flinch. German officers began to reassess the Canadian formations they faced. These were not inexperienced auxiliaries. They were not hesitant amateurs. They were soldiers who had absorbed the shock of first contact and responded by narrowing their focus. Ground mattered, timing mattered. Survival depended on action, not belief. By the end of these early encounters, something irreversible had occurred. The SS no longer treated the Canadian sector as an opportunity for rapid success. It became a problem to be managed, a front that consumed resources and attention out of proportion to its size. The Canadians had forced themselves into the center of German concern not through spectacle, but through persistence. Fear, by now, was no longer theoretical. It was learned, and learning tends to leave marks that do not fade easily. The rules that governed how the war was supposed to be fought did not vanish all at once. They eroded. They thinned under pressure, bent by exhaustion, anger, and the cumulative weight of small decisions made too quickly to be examined. In the Canadian sector, that erosion accelerated in the days after first contact with the 12th SS. What had begun as a brutal but recognizable battlefield began to slip into something harsher, where assumptions about surrender, restraint, and reciprocity could no longer be relied upon. The executions of Canadian prisoners did not occur in a single moment or place. They happened in fragments across roadsides, gardens, courtyards, and improvised headquarters. Men captured during chaotic fighting were separated, questioned briefly, then killed. Some were shot immediately. Others were held for hours before being executed. The locations varied, but the effect did not. News of what had happened spread with a speed that surprised even those who carried it. Survivors told their units. Bodies were found. Patterns were recognized. For Canadian soldiers, this knowledge altered the emotional geometry of the battlefield. Fear of capture was replaced by something colder and more dangerous: certainty. Certainty that being wounded and overrun might not mean survival. Certainty that hesitation could be fatal. This did not produce disorder. It produced compression. Men focused more narrowly on their immediate surroundings, their section, their field of fire. Engagements became shorter and more violent, because there was no longer any expectation that restraint would be met with restraint. From the German perspective, particularly within the SS, the killings were justified through a mixture of belief and misinterpretation. There were rumors that Canadian units had been ordered to take no prisoners during the landings. Some SS officers claimed to have found written confirmation of such orders. Whether these claims were accurate mattered less than the fact that they were believed. Belief hardened policy. Policy hardened behavior. This belief also served a purpose. It discouraged surrender among SS troops who were already facing an enemy they did not fully understand. If capture meant death, then fighting on became the only rational option. In this way, fear was turned inward, used to discipline one's own forces as much as to confront the enemy. But fear has a tendency to leak. It does not stay contained within doctrine. As fighting continued, German units outside the SS began to absorb the consequences of this cycle. They heard how engagements with Canadians unfolded. They saw how quickly battles escalated. They noticed that Canadian troops did not pause when contact was made, that they pressed, that they did not negotiate space. For German commanders, this introduced a new layer of concern. An enemy that does not reliably accept surrender forces different decisions. Defensive positions must be held longer. Withdrawals must be cleaner. Encounters become all or nothing more quickly. The margin for error shrinks. The Canadians did not articulate this shift openly. There were no formal declarations, no change in official orders, but behavior changed all the same. SS units were treated differently. Engagements with them were faster, closer, and less forgiving. The possibility of disengagement faded. Fighting became personal, not because of hatred, but because the environment demanded it. This was not a descent into chaos. It was a narrowing of options. In such conditions, professionalism takes on a harder edge. Survival depends on denying the enemy time, space, and opportunity. Canadian units that had already demonstrated a willingness to advance aggressively now demonstrated an equal willingness to close decisively, to end fights rather than manage them. German commanders recognized this shift, even if they did not describe it in moral terms. Reports noted increased ferocity, encounters that resulted in high casualties on both sides, a reluctance among Canadian troops to disengage once committed. This was not written as admiration. It was written as warning. What made this especially troubling was that the Canadians did not appear out of control. There was no breakdown in discipline. Units continued to hold ground, respond to orders, and coordinate with neighboring formations. The violence was not random. It was directed. This distinction mattered. An enemy driven by rage can be predicted. An enemy who remains controlled while fighting without expectation of mercy is harder to manage. The Canadians occupied that space uncomfortably well. By the time German commanders fully understood what the killings had set in motion, it was no longer something that could be reversed through orders alone. The battlefield had been reshaped. Each encounter carried more weight. Each decision carried more consequence. Fear now was no longer abstract or professional. It was situational. The Canadians had crossed an invisible line, not by choice, but by circumstance. And once crossed, there was no simple way back. By July, the shape of the battlefield had settled into something grimly familiar. The beaches were far behind now, replaced by hedgerows, shattered villages, and ridgelines, whose names meant little to anyone outside a narrow strip of Normandy. The initial chaos of the landings had given way to a grinding, deliberate struggle for ground, measured not in miles, but in fields and crossroads. This was the phase of the campaign where reputation is no longer formed by surprise, but by endurance. For the German commanders facing the Canadians, this period was perhaps the most unsettling of all. The early fear born from unexpected speed had matured into something heavier. The Canadians did not simply attack and withdraw. They returned, again and again. They absorbed punishment that should have forced pauses, reorganizations, relief. Instead, pressure continued, sometimes unevenly, sometimes clumsily, but rarely absent. At places like Carpiquet, the logic of defense should have prevailed. The airfield and its surrounding village were fortified, covered by interlocking fire, and held by experienced German troops who understood the terrain. The Canadian assaults there were costly and on paper inefficient, yet they kept coming. When one attack stalled, another followed. When progress was minimal, positions were held under fire rather than abandoned. From the German side, this was exhausting to counter. Every successful defense demanded constant vigilance because the Canadians did not interpret repulse as defeat. They treated it as information. This persistence forced German units into a reactive posture. Reserves that might have been used elsewhere were committed repeatedly to blunt Canadian attacks that refused to die quietly. The Canadians became a kind of fixed weight on the German front, pinning formations in place not through decisive breakthroughs, but through the certainty that any relaxation would be exploited. Nowhere was this more apparent than along Verrières Ridge. The ridge dominated the approaches south of Caen and had become a magnet for German armor and artillery. Holding it was essential. Losing it was unthinkable. The Canadians were ordered to take it anyway. The assault that followed was catastrophic. Units advanced into fire they could not suppress. Communications failed. Supporting armor was delayed or destroyed. Men were cut down in open ground with no cover and little hope of reinforcement. Entire companies ceased to exist in anything but name. From a purely tactical perspective, it was a failure. From the German perspective, it was something else entirely. What troubled German commanders was not that the Canadians had attacked and been destroyed. That happened often enough on the Eastern Front. What troubled them was that the Canadians had attacked knowing the risk, and had done so as part of a broader operational logic. They were not seeking glory. They were fixing German forces in place. They were absorbing attention, ammunition, and armor that could not be spared elsewhere. This realization reframed Canadian behavior entirely. They were no longer seen simply as stubborn infantry or aggressive raiders. They were part of a system that used pressure itself as a weapon. Even failed attacks had value. Even losses served a purpose. Against such an approach, conventional measures of success became unreliable. German reports from this period increasingly described Canadian units as unyielding. Not reckless, but relentless. There was a difference. Recklessness burns out. Relentlessness wears down those forced to respond to it. The Canadians did not always win ground, but they rarely ceded it easily. When they took a position, they dug in with an expectation of immediate counterattack. When they lost one, they probed for a way back. For German soldiers on the line, this created a psychological toll that went beyond fear of death. It was the fatigue of knowing that no quiet sector existed opposite Canadian units. No place where pressure would ease simply because night had fallen or an attack had failed. Rest became conditional. Relief became temporary. German commanders began to plan around this reality. Canadian sectors were reinforced not because breakthroughs were imminent, but because neglect was dangerous. The Canadians had become an anchor point in the Allied line, a force that could be relied upon to hold German attention regardless of cost. This was perhaps the deepest source of fear. Not that the Canadians were unstoppable, but that they were dependable. In war, unpredictability is dangerous, but reliability in an enemy can be worse. It allows planners to anticipate pressure without knowing exactly where it will fall. By late July, the Canadians were no longer underestimated. They were factored in. Their presence altered German calculations, diverted resources, and constrained movement. The fear they inspired was no longer reactive. It was structural. They had become a problem that could not be ignored and could not be solved quickly. And in a campaign defined by time, that may have been their most decisive contribution of all. By August, the character of the fighting had shifted again. The hedgerows that had slowed everything down were giving way to open movement, and with it came a different kind of danger. For the German forces in Normandy, the problem was no longer how to hold ground, but how to leave it without collapsing entirely. Retreat, when managed well, can preserve an army. Retreat under pressure becomes something else. The Canadians were now operating in an environment that rewarded coordination rather than improvisation. This suited them. The weeks of attritional fighting north of Caen had hardened their units, stripped away any lingering illusions, and left behind formations that understood their role precisely. They were not chasing glory, they were closing space. Operations like Totalize revealed this shift clearly. The attack did not rely on a single dramatic breakthrough. It relied on pressure applied across a broad front, supported by armor, artillery, and an understanding that night, confusion and speed could be used together rather than separately. German commanders facing this offensive were struck by how little time they were given to react. Positions that might once have held for days were bypassed or overwhelmed before coherent resistance could form. This was no longer the unpredictable advance of June. It was deliberate. As Canadian and Polish units pushed south, The German retreat began to take on a funnel shape. Roads filled with vehicles moving east and south, often without clear orders, often under air attack. Units became intermingled. Command structures frayed. What had been a fighting withdrawal began to resemble flight. The Canadians did not pursue recklessly. They moved with an understanding of what the retreat represented. An army under pressure is most vulnerable not when it is strongest, but when it is trying to escape. The goal was no longer territory for its own sake. It was containment. At places like Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive, this logic became brutally clear. A small Canadian force under Major David Currie positioned itself astride one of the last viable escape routes for German units attempting to flee the closing pocket. Currie did not command a large formation. He did not possess overwhelming firepower. What he had was timing and resolve. For 2 days, his force held under constant attack. German columns tried to break through. Tanks, infantry, artillery elements, all moving with the desperation of men who understood what encirclement meant. The Canadians did not yield. They repositioned, counterattacked, held buildings reduced to rubble, and used every advantage the terrain offered. Currie himself moved openly under fire, directing defense, rallying men, making it clear that collapse was not an option. From the German side, this was devastating, not just tactically, but psychologically. An escape route blocked by a small, determined force sends a different message than one blocked by overwhelming numbers. It suggests inevitability. The knowledge spread quickly among the retreating units. The route was closed. Resistance continued in places, but surrender followed in waves. Thousands of German soldiers laid down their arms to Canadian troops in the final days of the pocket. This was not because the Canadians were more merciful than others, nor because the Germans were uniquely inclined to surrender to them. It was because the Canadians had placed themselves where surrender became the only remaining rational choice. For German commanders who survived the encirclement, the lesson was unmistakable. The Canadians were not just effective on the attack or stubborn on the defense. They understood how to end battles. They did not merely push an enemy back. They closed the space behind him. Fear at this stage was no longer about reputation or rumor. It was experiential. German officers who had once underestimated Canadian formations now spoke of them with a different tone, not hatred, not exaggeration, recognition. These were troops who could be relied upon to complete an operation even when conditions were chaotic, even when resistance was fierce. The collapse of German forces in Normandy was the result of many factors, but the role of the Canadians in sealing that collapse was undeniable. They were not the largest force. They were not the most heavily equipped, but they were positioned where outcome mattered most, and they stayed there. When the fighting finally moved east, out of Normandy and toward the Seine, the fear the Canadians inspired lingered. It was not attached to any single moment, but to a pattern now fully visible. Once engaged, they did not disengage lightly. Once an opportunity appeared, they acted on it. Once an enemy began to retreat, they did not simply follow. They anticipated where the retreat would end. That understanding, learned too late, was what many German commanders carried with them as they withdrew from France. What the German commanders carried away from Normandy was not a single image or moment, but an accumulation. Fear, in their case, did not arrive as panic or awe. It arrived as adjustment. Each encounter with Canadian units added weight to a conclusion that became harder to avoid. These were formations that altered the shape of a battle simply by being present. Early assumptions had framed the Canadians as competent but secondary. That framing did not survive sustained contact. By the end of the campaign, Canadian sectors were treated with caution, not because disaster was guaranteed there, but because predictability had vanished. German commanders learned that where Canadians held ground, it would be contested stubbornly. Where they attacked, resistance would be met repeatedly until either the position fell or its value was exhausted. Where they appeared unexpectedly, they tended to remain. This mattered more than raw aggressiveness. Many armies can attack fiercely for a short time. Fewer can maintain pressure while adapting to losses, reorganizing under fire, and continuing to function as a coherent force. The Canadians demonstrated that ability consistently. They were not immune to error or misjudgment. They suffered catastrophic losses. But their response to failure was not withdrawal into caution. It was recalibration. German officers noticed this pattern. Reports increasingly describe Canadian units not in terms of enthusiasm or morale, but in terms of reliability. That is a dangerous quality in an enemy. It allows planners to assume pressure will continue regardless of immediate outcomes. It forces defensive decisions to be made earlier and with fewer options. The fear the Canadians inspired was therefore not theatrical. It did not depend on stories of brutality or legend, though those circulated as well. It depended on experience, on seeing positions held longer than expected, on watching counterattacks arrive sooner than anticipated, on discovering that withdrawal, once begun, did not guarantee escape. This understanding reshaped how German commanders spoke about the Canadians after the campaign. Not as amateurs, not as auxiliaries, but as professionals, as soldiers who had learned how to fight modern war without relying on spectacle. The Canadians did not need to shock the enemy into submission. They wore him down through presence, timing, and refusal to disengage prematurely. There was also a quieter recognition that Canadian command culture contributed to this effect. Initiative at lower levels meant disruption did not paralyze units. Loss of senior officers did not collapse formations. This made Canadian behavior harder to predict and harder to exploit. German doctrine emphasized exploiting moments of weakness. Against the Canadians, those moments were brief. By the time the front moved east, German commanders no longer debated whether the Canadians were dangerous. That question had been settled. The debate instead concerned how to manage contact with them, whether to avoid them when possible, whether to concentrate strength against them or distribute it. These are not questions asked about a marginal force. For the Canadians themselves, there was little interest in how the enemy perceived them. The cost of the campaign was too high for reflection to feel meaningful. Entire units had been shattered. Towns had been taken and lost and taken again. The work of moving forward continued, now into flooded lowlands and new terrain that demanded the same endurance Normandy had. Yet reputation, once earned, travels. The Germans carried theirs with them into later fighting, just as they had carried memories of the First World War into the Second. Fear, in this sense, became institutional. It did not attach to individuals so much as to patterns. Canadian units were associated with pressure, with persistence, with closure rather than contact alone. This was the final lesson of Normandy. Fear is not born from violence in isolation. It is born from consistency, from knowing what an enemy will do even when conditions change. The Canadians did not win every engagement. They did not always advance efficiently, but they behaved in ways that forced the enemy to account for them constantly. That is what German commanders learned too late, that the Canadians were not an anomaly of D-Day, nor a temporary surge of effort. They were an army that, once committed, followed through. And in war, there are few qualities more unsettling than that.